Well, all right, I think we'll get going. Again, I'm David Dumke. It's a pleasure to have you join us today, and it's also much appreciated to have our two experts, our two panelists, join us today from Turkey, both from Istanbul. UCF's own Hakan Özoğlu, who is a professor of history and also the director of the Middle East Studies program, and Sanem Güner, who's the assistant director of the Hollings Center for International Dialogue. I would note that the Hollings Center has been a longtime partner of Global Perspectives on a number of issues, and so it's certainly a pleasure to have Sanem join us today. There's been much talk recently about the US-Turkey relationship, especially after President Biden and President Erdogan met recently on the sidelines of the NATO summit. But there hasn't been a whole lot of discussion about what is actually going on in Turkish society today. Well into the second decade of the Erdogan era in Turkey, how does this compare to previous periods in Turkish history? What's going on in civil society? What are forcing political issues to come to the surface? How is the Turkish economy doing? What is the situation inside the country? So today we hope to get some insight on that. And we'll start with Hakan Özoğlu, who will provide us with some historical perspective. Welcome to our event, Hakan. Thank you for joining us.
Yes. What I'd like to do today is actually to assist the following speaker. In that sense, my role here is just to lay out some philosophical questions, such as, does history repeat itself? Is there any patterns in history that we can detect and perhaps predict the future? I have worked in early Turkish politics, and what is happening today, it seems to me that there is a pattern in Turkish political history, and it's repeating itself. It's actually starting from, it's not unique to Turkey, obviously, but starting from the Ottoman periods too. That is to say that the perception of state in this society, it has always been sacred, in a sense that gives protection to those in power. So in other words, state is an armor to be worn by those who come to power and identify themselves as the state. This is an amazing protection. Once they come to power, they wear this armor and then do not accept any criticism. Now, we see that at the present government, but this is not new. So there is a pattern that one can look at. And when we look at this issue, especially if we study history, I wonder if we could have predicted what's happening today. So that is, in a sense, what I like to, my framework is. In that sense, those who come to power does not allow any opposition, let it be coming from different political parties or grassroots movements. It's obviously a lot easier for the state to buy out the grassroots movements, or do not allow them, or create their own grassroots movements to support their own politics. This has always been the case in Turkey. So the social change, the meaningful social change, usually comes to fore, not because of the grassroots movements, but because of the cliques of those who share power. So the power struggle is a reason for the political change. When I say that, I'm trying to be the devil's advocate and undermine the position of the following speaker, because she's too optimistic, which I don't like. So the big question is there really a pattern in Turkish society that repeats itself? I see that in early Turkish Republic, those in power, starting from the creation of the Turkish Republic, I would say, their relations with the public is always been the father figure. Those are the ones that, as opposed to responding to their demands, always they wanted to delete them. So those in power are figures who creates the change, whatever that may be. What I like to do, I think I have only 15 minutes. I don't know if I would like to, because this should be a discussion in my opinion. But within this context, what I like to do now is just read you a short paragraph, 2 short paragraphs of an observation of an American diplomat about the Turkish society. This is in 1925 when the Turkish Republic suppressed the opposition party and any other opposition to silence the political opposition. And the American observer, was actually more interested in this case, what the people are thinking about these major changes. Most importantly, an empire is collapsing or a collapse by this time, and a new regime emerged, a new regime to be more secular, and there is a parliament. And this continuation of 600 years of an empire life suddenly ends. So what is the position? What do the people were thinking, or at least voice their opinion? Here, let me read the quotation. And it starts, "The average Turk does not care for politics and has an almost superstitious respect for what those in power think and do." I think we can associate that to present almost. "He may mildly disagree with some act of the government, but it is an affair of a day or so to be forgotten completely after an incredibly short time. There is nothing cumulative in this process, and the ideas of the last straw which breaks the camel's back cannot therefore be applied to Turkish politics." I like this. Let me read it again. "There is nothing cumulative in this process, and the idea of the last straw which breaks the camel's back cannot therefore be applied to Turkish politics. As long as taxes are reasonably low, the average Turk is quite content to let the government do what it wants." Now, when I came across to this line, this paragraph, it sparked all these thoughts in my mind, and I like, perhaps this could be something to discuss. Is it still so, or what changed? Are the Turks still can take on these straws, and there's no last straw that could break their back, and then they can get organized and somehow pressure the government? So this is an interesting observation. Another observation is about the parliament. Again, these are not my words, so don't blame me for it. Now, this time, another observer went to Ankara and watched what's happening in the assembly to see if people's voice is represented in the parliament. And then I quote, it says, "The assembly naturally must not be taken seriously. A serious student of parliamentary life would be out of place in Ankara. The assembly is a play that goes in order to make a few unobservant people forget what Mustafa Kemal Pasha is doing. Sometimes the Ghazi president is present while the play is going on, and then, of course, the acting is even better." What he's saying is that parliament is just an act. And continues, "There is only one determining factor in Ankara, that is Mustafa Kemal Pasha. The rest, including the assembly, the cabinet, is chiefly a camouflage. There is no semblance of democracy or of self-government at Ankara. The government is a disguised dictatorship, and often the disguise is very thin indeed. Ankara is an ideal environment in which narrow nationalism can develop to its logical extreme and in time kill itself. This process is now going on rapidly. Turkey will not adopt these reforms, meaning secularist reforms, and especially the secularization of Ankara. Therefore, these reforms and this secularization are to be forced down to throats of the Turks by tribunals of independence, suppressing newspapers, and other kindred practices. The tragedy of it all is that there is not enough intelligence in the Ankara crowd to see that Turkey is once more back in the old vicious circle of tyranny begetting revolutionary opposition, which then it comes to power, follows in the footsteps of tyranny, which has been overthrown. Only superficially has Turkey progressed since the days of Abdülhamid. End of quote. So my question becomes is that if this is the pattern that Turkey is repeating itself, and at the present, perhaps the following speaker, Sanem, could bring us to the present and sees any similarities, perhaps tell us that there are differences and there is hope for the future. And I will stop here and turn it to Sanem.
All right, Sanem, you've got your work cut out for you to be positive. This is about hopes and challenges, not just historic precedent that leads to a pretty negative place. So with that, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And it's always a pleasure to be collaborating with UCF and the Office of Global Perspectives. But I must say that today I'm leaving off my hat as the Hollings Center's Assistant Dialogue and speaking more in an individual capacity. You know, when we were speaking earlier with Professor Özoğlu and David about how we could structure this talk in an interesting way, we decided that there was already a lot of doom and gloom about Turkey, both in international and American media, and whatever coverage that Turkey gets is pretty much dominated by narratives about its leadership and whether you know its democracy is backsliding, whether it's abandoning its traditional Western alliances and alignments in favor of alignments and alliances with more authoritarian regimes like Russia. And of course, we all have our responses to those questions, and they more or less coalesce around one idea, and that is that Turkey is not what it used to be, especially in the early 2000s. Whether that's in the realm of foreign policy, as a you know, as an actor in its region that could be a mediating force, a stabilizing force in this turbulent region, or domestically, a country that's on its way to acceding to the European Union as a full member, and thus undergoing all of these various legal and social and economic reforms, or a country that was deemed a model for others around it, with its civic engagement and economic potential. So Turkey is not what it used to be. But I've been working in this civil society realm for almost 20 years now, and I've had the honor of being a part of various advocacy groups and social movements for probably longer than that. And what I said about Turkey earlier, that it's not what it used to be, is pretty much true in this round too. So I'd like to caveat my hopes and optimistic part of my talk with this. It's not what it used to be. I would, though, like to bring to the table a more hopeful approach compared to Professor Özoğlu's, and talk about potential and also successes. And my proposition for this brief talk is going to be as follows. So all of the major challenges that we all are familiar with, that Turkey is facing, domestically or abroad, integrating and educating Syrian refugees, reducing ethnic tensions, improving educational outcomes at all levels of education, bringing more women into the labor force, into the economy. You name it, you name the problem. Civil society organizations are still the ones leading the efforts in all of these fronts. And they are the ones that are bringing the solutions to the table. So I guess I'll be the counterpoint to the previous speaker, in that I believe that, despite the many, many challenges to civil society, we're still here, we're still active, and we're still relevant. But of course, again, repeating my caveat, I'm really humbled to be following Professor Özoğlu, in that I think it's really key for us to understand the state mentality and the society's perception of the Turkish state in dealing, when we're also talking about civil society in Turkey today. But I would like to color that picture a little bit with the experience of my generation and my own personal experience. So we grew up, my generation, so the Turkish X and Y generations, roughly, we grew up in what was a military regime for all intents and purposes. And the society that we grew up in was pretty much shaped by fear of anything that was political. And those of you who have been to Turkey will know that Turkish people are very opinionated and not afraid to speak on politics and soccer. But that was not the case. That was not the case as when I was growing up, at least not in a publicly visible way. So the militaristic mindset throughout the 80s and 90s had no tolerance for an average person's involvement, engagement in anything that was remotely political. And the atmosphere of fear and censorship meant that any sort of advocacy or campaigning was kind of seen as pretty radical. So again, the Turkish X and Y generations were deemed or were regarded as the apolitical generation. No will or no eagerness to act politically, be involved socially, except going and casting votes every 5 years. But I would argue, and here's the reason of my optimism, that there were several incidents, several phenomena that changed this, or that proved this to be wrong, that we were an apolitical generation, that there is no hope for the future of Turkey. And these the three examples that I chose are pretty much sort of the more internationally known examples, and the examples could actually be diversified. But the three examples that I would like to talk about are the 2003 No to War in Iraq campaign, of course, the 2013 Gezi protests, and more generally, the women's movement that I think has its roots very much prior to the Turkish Republic, but has sort of become more of a of a civil society movement in the Western sense, I would say, in the 70s and 80s, and has grown ever since. And I'll focus more in on the women's movement, especially in a second. But let me tell you why I think these are turning points. Despite the states narrowing the civic space throughout the Republic's history, as Professor Özoğlu mentioned, protests and various rights struggles have, I think, found more strength and gained grounds by widening their appeal and diversifying, becoming more inclusive. So inclusivity, number one. It's really important to bridge the gaps among the participants when it comes to uniting them under the umbrella of a movement, whether that's a protest, whether that's a demand of a trade union, whether that's women's demands. It's really important that uniting language is being used, and I argue that Turkish civil society has a lot of experience with this. Secondly, these movements have all been grassroots movements, and I think that's really important. No top-down hierarchy that's dictating anything. Although there are organizations, and of course there are organizational hierarchies, I would say in general, as someone who's witnessed all three of these in person, I would say that the non-hierarchical or the minimally hierarchical nature of these movements is something that's successful, and the grassroots character is something that's successful. And also, again, focusing a little bit more on the women's movement, I think it's intersectionality, to use a term that's very commonly used nowadays. the movement is relevant and successful because it's always been really vocal and fearless for all kinds of injustice, whether that's LGBTQ groups, whether that's within the anti-war movement, whether that's within labor movements. I would say that women's organizations have always taken active part. So thus far, that's kind of my groundwork, and I can imagine some of our audience kind of going or asking, well, if civil society is so successful, then how come, let's say, the government has withdrawn from the Istanbul Convention, which is the short name for the European Convention, the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing Violence Against Women, or how come women are still victims of violence or killings, in hundreds every year, and nothing is seemingly being done about it. But I'd kind of like to go back to the point about having the women's movement having had significant gains in this country, and then the early 2000s, the campaign to rectify, to change the penal code and the civic code in Turkey was actually spearheaded by women's organizations, and I think all history books should write it this way. That was a victory, that was a gain, that was a point that was scored by the women's organizations, and I see that as a success because what was codified in the previous versions of the Turkish civic and penal codes before the reforms happened in the early 2000s and 2005 and 7 respectively, I think, was a mentality that saw no problem in honor killings, saw the male as the head of the household, the mentality that the woman's place was her home, and so on. So this was what I'm trying to get at, is that not only were these seen as unyielding social norms, but they were also codified into law, and that means that the struggle to change these was not it wasn't a straight path. It wasn't a straight, clear path to victory. Like all struggles, it had its ups and downs. There were defeats and fails along the way, and there were disagreements and divisions that could have been detrimental. But the end result was a success because of the inclusivity, the intersectionality, and the grassroots nature of the movement as a whole. And had it not been, had the women's movement not been such a united front, this would have been difficult. Going back to a point that Professor Özoğlu mentioned, how does this change come about? I don't disagree that a lot of other factors have to fall in place for these radical changes to happen in Turkish law. So had Turkey not been an EU member candidate back then, this would not have happened, of course. Had there not been political will, these changes would not have happened. I agree with that too. So like all revolutionary moments, all of these things have to come together at a very specific time in a very specific way. But that doesn't, I don't think that changes the fact that women's movement these organizations were the agents of this change. And so to conclude, so that we can have a discussion here, I come to the, so what? So what if civil society, and if these movements have been successful, and if they are even if they are active currently, so what happens? And that to me has two answers. And the first one is more sort of policy. It's the policy answer. American or European politicians, when they're dealing with Turkey, or scholars, or people who are in the policy influencing think tank world, tend to over-focus on politics at a higher level, in my opinion, in their forecasts and analyses about Turkey. They look at political parties, they look at political party figureheads, opposition party figureheads, So for example, there's a lot of interest lately in the former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu's party, in the former economics minister Ali Babacan's party. All of these, pro-democracy people are asking about these newly formed parties, or they're looking at cracks within the governing party, within government. They look at unrest. And I'm not saying that those are the wrong places to look if we're forecasting how more democratic change will come about in a country or in Turkey. But I am saying that perhaps decision makers and scholars alike should look more at the civic space and what's going on there, and what kinds of opposition forces there are in that space, because that space is what truly reflects Turkey's diverse character, in my opinion. And those organizations and advocacy groups and campaigns, whether they're big or small, local or national, I think will be the ones that convince the powers that be for change and reforms. They will still spearhead any sort of social demand for change. So again, the policy conclusion I come to is that these policies of engagement with Turkey should be a little bit more geared towards opening channels of communication with civil society and strengthening civil society, not opposition political parties. Some would argue that political parties are still civil society, but for my talk's purposes, I define civil society as more being in the space of rights advocacy. My second answer of the so what has to do with support, and especially material support. Those who believe in supporting democracy in Turkey should know that civil society organizations are desperately in need of funding and capacity building at varying levels. Some are much better at finding their own funds, and some still need a lot of help. So the message that I conclude with is that as more of these sort of international solidarity happens, civil society will be renewed and reopened. And I think civil society's resilience is the hope for a better future in Turkey. And again, I don't want to be understood as whitewashing anything, but I would like all of us to look at Turkey from this fresh perspective for a change. And I guess the question we could discuss, a question we could discuss here today, sort of combining Professor Özoğlu's talk and my talk, is there hope for this sort of a renewal and reopening of civil society? And would that change political discourse? Would that change the political discourse in Turkey? And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanem. Really appreciate that. You're kind of stealing my thunder as moderator by suggesting the question. We'll ask that one at the end about hope. And we've got several good questions that are coming in, but I wanted to start by asking each of you a question. This event is not about President Erdogan per se, but of course you're talking about contemporary Turkey. You can't avoid it. And obviously one of the seminal events in this era has been the July 2016 coup attempt. So I'd like to ask first Hakan a question about if there are any historical parallels to coup attempts in Turkey and how that's affected governmental behavior. That's one. And then for Sanem, I'd like to ask, you're talking about the areas and issues that grassroots organizations have worked on in Turkey. How has that space changed since 2016? And have these efforts become more effective or less effective since that time?
In any particular order, or?
Well, I think I'm on mute first. Well, we can start with you, Sanem. Well, okay. Camera ready?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, the July 2016 military coup attempt did have detrimental on on, on the civil society space and um, our activities in general. I would say that I mean, when there's such an existential threat to the government, I guess any government would respond in a defensive way, and I think that because of the traditional state structure and mentality that Hakan described, that's kind of the tradition in Turkish sort of state. It's to defend itself, and the society's reflex is also to defend the state. And so people kind of found it, you know, I don't want to say normal, but they understood that defensive posture that the government went into. The alleged perpetrators or the alleged people that were responsible for the 2016 coup attempt are very well known to be very much organized within civil society. And so that naturally had a detrimental effect on sort of cracking down indiscriminately on various civil society organizations' activities and finances and so on. That also meant that us that had nothing to do with, civil society organizations that had nothing to do with, the space in which the pro-Fethullah Gülen organizations operated, we also were under a lot of scrutiny. We also had to abide by, stricter reporting, stricter oversight by government bodies. So that the 2016 did have this detrimental effect.
Is it easing now? 5 years after that?
I think the legal framework has kind of tightened, but I think all organizations, regardless of what sort of space they're working in, have sort of adapted to this new framework. I wouldn't say it's easing, but I would say that because on certain issues the government has this practice of working sort of side by side with civil society organizations, most notably on the Syrian refugee issue. I would say that that's kind of getting back to its pre-2016 pace again, specifically on that front. Is there still skepticism towards, let's say, pro-democracy, sort of like advocacy groups and so on? Yes, there is. But there has always been, again. And that's kind of like a tide of, when there's something, when something happens, I guess, to Turkey in the realm of its foreign policy, that tide can turn pro or against, for or against civil society. And that's been kind of the case, for as long as I've worked for civil society, at least. But I would say that the immediate aftermath was pretty, was a lot darker, and now I'm seeing it open up a little bit more, although the legal framework is much tighter than what it used to be pre-2016.
Thank you. Hakan, can you hear us again, or?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, let me repeat the question. I asked a question about the July 2016 coup and how that affected behavior. Sanem was commenting on civil society before and after, and I guess the question towards you was about historical precedent of coup attempts in Turkey, and how is this any different than any previous attempts?
Yes, there's a historical precedence, but it's not the coups that are being, well, that too, but the time period that I worked, for example, in the early years of Turkish Republic, in order to silence the opposition, there are other means that were used as an excuse to silence the opposition. for example, in 1920s, they have multi-party system originally. It reduced to single-party system because of a Kurdish rebellion. So the Kurdish rebellion of 1925 is used as an excuse to silence the opposition. In fact, the similar words have been not uttered by the leaders of 1920s, that is the 2016 coup d'etat attempt. That is to say, this is a godsend for those in power to suppress the opposition. So again, there is this pattern that the governments usually use, or they themselves create. In fact, I looked at that issue too. If there is any hand for the Kurdish rebellion of 1925, the government used it. The other one is an attempt to kill Mustafa Kemal later on, and it's called the Izmir suikasti. And after that, also the different part of the, not only the civic society, but journalists and political parties and all kinds of opposition was suppressed. Surprising to see that 2016 coup d'etat attempt served the purpose of those in power, because there is historical. These are there are patterns for these things that allow us perhaps not to predict the future, but understand that certain things in the substructure of Turkish society and the political systems still survive. And if these things don't change and altered with, it doesn't matter who comes to power, we'll use this as an excuse to silence the opposition. Healthy opposition, let it be a political opposition or society has a great role to play. And in a sense, I'm hopeful after listening to Sanem's speech that the clouds are gathering. But the question again is that will they drop rain? Because usually they gather, nothing comes out of it, and they're being manipulated in many ways. So
perfect segue into our next question, which comes from the audience, and that is, recent polls have shown that President Erdogan's losing popularity. So the question is, for the upcoming Turkish election, which is in 2023, would he accept defeat if he lost? Don't both jump at it.
Well, these are questions to ask us, to predict the future, and that's almost impossible. I mean, you can go both ways for that. It won't be scholarly to predict the future, but we can do our best. I'm gonna let Sanem read the clouds and do the fortune telling.
I think Erdogan, if he got defeated, he would, but I don't think he will be defeated in 2023.
Okay, well, another question was about the direction that he's going, and I know that goes a little away from what we're talking about, but a question is about, is the goal of Erdogan to recreate the caliphate, or what is he trying to do at this point? What's kind of the motivation for government?
My personal opinion is that Erdogan is trying to stay in power. If the raising the hopes of caliphate helps him to reach that goal, he wouldn't mind bringing that issue to the front to gather some votes. But I do not think that his ultimate goal is the caliphate. One simple reason: caliphate is not Turkish. It's an international and spiritual organization that would have a lot of challenges and a lot of headaches for Erdogan's government. That has been tried in the 1920s again. The Islamic countries did not come together to elect one because there are a lot of external interferences. So the idea of caliphate is a great vote project, I would say. I don't know what Sanem would think.
I mean, I think in the post-COVID-19 world, after taking various, several hits economically, politically, with his party's popularity dropping, with lots of divisions within his party, with the economy really trying to pick up and not disintegrate. I think, of course, a politician who's in power is going to use a lot of rhetoric to gain all sorts of support from everyone. And again, I made a mention of the withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, and the reason for that is, although only 9% of the Turkish population have said they're in favor of the government withdrawing from this convention that's against domestic violence and against violence against women. Erdogan went ahead and did it because he wanted to speak to the the ultra conservative niche that he could reach out to, that he could grab votes from. And so I think these kinds of moves are all, this happens in any other country as well. It's not specific to Turkey. Turkey is not going to be, Erdogan is not going to declare himself the caliph, or Turkey is not going to be the center of the Islamic world, obviously. I think these are all like domestic politics questions. And I think it's kind of, I agree with Professor Özoğlu that these are survival strategies of a politician who's kind of trying to get votes from wherever he can.
Well, that leads us to another question coming from the audience, which is over the current government getting legitimacy from civil society groups. Do they get legitimacy from civil society groups, and what groups are those? And then asking, that's for you, Sanem, asking Hakan, the question would be, how much have Turkish governments in the past relied on popular support from civil society to maintain power?
Should I start?
Sorry.
Sanem, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, of course, civil society is very heterogeneous. It's not all, I guess, it's not all Turkish or Kurdish or secular or conservative, etc. It's not all urban. It's very rural as well in places. And so, of course, AK Party and Erdogan, of course, they have a large voter base in predominantly conservative cities around Anatolia, around sort of like mainland Turkey, especially outside the big cities, I would say. And well, of course, civil society in those, in those places, in those communities, again, of course, they do give legitimacy to AKP. It's not only Erdogan's rhetoric and the party and 20 years of governing that keeps things going. I think it's all those clientele networks as well. And again, we can question the character of these civil society organizations and their relationship to power as well. But of course, there are. I would say that a part of the AKP legitimacy does come from these more conservative, urban conservative groups, civil society groups.
Thank you.
What I like to say is that the state is in power of creating its own civil societies. If they want to, in fact, they do this in Erdogan regime too. They create their own civic societies and label the other ones as terrorists because they have the mechanisms of press and everything to label other ones, not civic societies, but terrorist organizations or so-called those that are brainwashed by outside powers or puppets. So in that sense, especially in Turkey, state is quite capable of creating a group of people and call it a civic society and responding to it, saying that we are following the people's will. Who defines people depends on who is in power. Again, starting from that original quotation is that The governments, especially the Erdogan government, manipulates this quite skillfully, saying that if you're not thinking the way they do, you're not the people, you're just an outsider trying to change the prosperity of the state. So we have to be very careful in defining what the civil society is, because the government can very easily present their own creations as civil societies. There are a lot of manipulations in creating that. For example, the government is trying to create an alternate bar. Well, it's not trying. They created an alternate bar for Istanbul and Ankara and some other places too, I guess, because the original bar in Turkey is quite oppositional to the government, the Bar Association, lawyers, and they created an alternative. Same for the doctors' organization. So if they say something critical about the government's dealing with how they pursue this COVID-19 threat, doctors usually come out and challenge that. That's quite interesting in Turkey. The most vocal group trying to challenge the government are the doctors. So then they go after them and they say these are not legitimate groups. They want to create their own doctors association coming from the like-minded people. So we have to be very careful about the civic societies as well. So I'm just, again, playing devil's advocate and not dashing Sanem's hopes, but these are very open to manipulations.
So I'd like to ask a question. Sanem, you've worked for a long time on women's rights issues and women's issues in general and a number of levels. And you mentioned in your earlier comments about women in the workforce and education. Turkey is a lot of things. On the one hand, it's a Muslim society, and there's a lot of conservative trends in there, although it's much more liberal than a lot of other Muslim countries in the world. There's a tradition of democracy, of republicanism, as opposed to Islamism. I'd like to ask you what issues have been effective in the women's realm that society has been able to if in the West would define as progress. How have women's issues played to Turkish society, not just in Istanbul, which is a much more cosmopolitan city, but in the rest of Turkey?
You mean how have sort of the women's struggles made Turkey into the, I guess, unique, predominantly Muslim society it is today?
I think that's one way of looking at it. The other is how do women's issues succeed? How do they advance there in a society that is a lot of different things, including conservative outside of the cities?
I think that's a great question, and I think that the key in women's issues being successful is that they start. If you look at the history of these struggles, they've always started from the lowest common denominator. The best known women's campaign, women's rights campaign in Turkey was in the 80s against domestic violence. No to beating. So that was actually the first sort of organized women's mass protest that I guess feminists or women's rights advocates in Turkey sort of date the history of the movement to. And that's a very, very sort of low common denominator. Everybody would say no to domestic violence. Again, other sort of lowest common denominators have been honor killings, killing women in the name of honor, participation in the workforce and equal, I guess, equality for women and men within the economy and within the labor force. I would say that the key to success has been always starting from that lowest common denominator, and also sort of this we learn as we go kind of practice of being able to reach out to. For example, the no to beatings campaign started very much as a a more urban, sort of middle-class women's movement, but then it's reached out to more conservative, more rural women. And I think, I think that kind of outreach and that kind of openness to diversity is something that's made it powerful. And again, these more localized, I guess, advocates, women's rights advocates that I would, again, date back to the days, the 70s and 80s, where, the movement was still very small and very young and very inexperienced, but still had, reach in these smaller communities. I think those were all very much sort of seeds that then grew into more organized efforts. Something else that's been really effective is, I would say, the women's movement, specifically within the east and southeast of Turkey, so the Kurdish women's movement. That's been one of the most vocal. Again, that's where statistically, where most of the honor killings were happening at a certain point in time, and so women actually rebelled against this and the feudal structure of the communities there. And I think it's, a combination of a lot of factors, but I think the more uniting sort of language that women's movement has used throughout the past, few decades has been its success. I'll also add a note here that I think what's been really detrimental to in my opinion, lately, is the discussions that are happening on social media. And I usually liken this to sort of like gladiators fighting it out on the battlefield. And these gladiators are not enemies. They're two different sort of perspectives within the movement, two different feminist perspectives, let's say. And so that's kind of been detrimental, and that's like it's like the antithesis to a huge history of a successful women's advocacy campaign throughout the better part of last century, I would say.
Well, thank you for that. Hakan, I want to see if you have a counterpoint, because Sanem's talking about success from bottoms up, grassroots-based activism. Is this something that's happened throughout the history of the Turkish Republic, or is this relatively new to the last few decades?
It is relatively new. It has never been this successful. So I have to give in to Sanem's hopes and saying that there is hope, because these groups are gathering in a much more organized way. And of course, the technology helps them to do so. That's another important game changer, if you will. In the past, the government is quite successfully interfered with these grassroots movements, syndicates included. But now there are many communication going outside the control of the government, and these people are organizing and then following the literature in the world and have their better connections with international communities and structures. But in my opinion, the change in Turkey has always been up, down, and that sometimes from top to down, the top is almost always influenced by an outside power too. So I heard that many years ago, by a Turkish minister saying that we did not do, Tanzimat is not our will, it was the outsiders who pressured us to do those things. So in that sense, as I said, the international community will have to play a vital role in pushing Turkey more in respecting human rights, and feminist movements are part of it, but only a part of it. There are many other groups within the society, and the changing point would be when government realizes that they cannot sustain this level of control of civic societies, and they try to give in little by little. and this would be the success of civic societies. But we don't know what other powers are at play, and hopefully we will see soon. Elections are coming. I'm not actually, we reverse the roles in that sense. Sanem thinks that the current government would come out of successful. I'm not that, it will show my colors, but I'm not that pessimistic. So it is very possible that the current government will lose its grasp of the elections. The fear is that what happens next? Would they really go peacefully, or would they do some Trump-like moves to somehow alter the elections? And then would that cause some kind of bloody events on the ground in Turkey? Any of these things are possible. So that's my pessimistic part that I can put it on. But it is quite possible that the current government can go with election.
Well, I'm going to, given your kind of mix of pessimism with just a trace of optimism in there, Hakan, appreciate that. We're at the end of our hour, and I really appreciate you both being here, but I'm going to give the final question to Sanem, and that is on the hope side. You're still optimistic. You said earlier it was better, but it was also worse in the past. So do you think the cycle is still moving forward in a positive way or not?
Again, I think in the post-COVID-19 world, or in the post-COVID-19 sort of effort to get up and get the country back up on its feet again, I feel like my observation is that the government and the president, the leadership, has kind of they've all kind of softened their positions on various fronts, whether that's foreign policy, whether that's they're dealing with the United States or the European Union, or whether that's dealing with civil society. I think we will see in the upcoming months. I'm hopeful on this front, and for personal reasons as well. I think we will see some positive developments, especially with regards to sort of these high level cases that have very much been in the limelight, such as the Osman Kavala case, for example, or the HDP, the former HDP officials being tried for the Kobani incidents case. I think there will be maybe not all of these will result, will end in the way that us pro-democracy people want them to. But I think we will see some positive messaging from the government. I think again, and this is not specific to civil society. I think this is more Turkey trying to be not vulnerable in an already sort of vulnerable situation. It's trying to I think kind of become a country that's a little less troublemaking and more sort of cooperative, and so I feel that this these few months are going to be a bit more positive on many fronts. I hope I'm right, and I hope this is not reading the clouds, and it's more political analysis than reading the clouds. But I think going back to some of the questions about Erdogan's falling popularity, I think these might also be moves to get some of the some of that popularity back.
Well, thank you very much. You go ahead, Hakan.
Just short. The governments come and go. This government will go at the end. But if you remember the last sentence of the second quotation I read from an American observer, is that it creates a vicious circle, that the new group, whoever they may be, exact opposite of in terms of political ideology to this current one, when they come to power, will they follow more or less a similar paths? So if history repeats itself, they will. So in that sense, certain things need to change in Turkish political structure so that whoever comes to power cannot create this kind of troubles for the people.
Thank you very much, Hakan Özoğlu, Sanem Güner. Thank you. We hope to have another installment of Turkey Talks in the future and hope you can join us, and we hope to see you in Orlando very soon. And thank you all for joining us today. This event will be accessible on the Global Perspectives website, which is ucfglobalperspectives.org. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.